The car was already doing 90 when Daravos slammed it into the tunnel and the headlights swallowed the dark. She didn't look in the mirror. She knew what was behind her. Mira sat in the back seat with her knees pulled up to her chest and her eyes wide open, the way children look when they're too scared to blink. She was 7 years old, or she had the body of a 7-year-old, which wasn't quite the same thing. The distinction mattered. It had been explained to Dara 3 times, and she still wasn't sure she understood it, but she was sure of this. If the things pursuing them caught the girl, everything alive on Earth would be dead inside of a year. Not conquered, not enslaved, dead. The Varric didn't want a planet. They wanted what the planet contained, what the girl contained. Dara. The voice from the passenger seat was flat and controlled, the kind of flat that takes years of catastrophe to produce. Second group, 11 o'clock. She didn't look at 11 o'clock. She cut the wheel hard right, felt the rear tires bark against the tunnel wall, and kept the accelerator pressed to the floor. Beside her, Russell Payne reached out one hand and braced himself against the dashboard without complaint. He'd been a detective with Cascadia Sovereignty Police for 19 years before fraud dissolved the sovereignty and replaced it with an occupation. He'd been a lot of things since. What he was now at this precise moment was the man riding shotgun in a vehicle that was technically the property of a collapsed government, pursuing a route that was technically a maintenance tunnel, not designed for vehicle traffic, trying to keep a child alive who was technically not a child at all. Technically. Mira reached forward and touched the back of Dara's neck with 2 fingers, light as a moth landing. Left, Mira said. Then down. Down is underground. Yes. Russell turned in his seat to look at the girl. His expression was the particular expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything, and found no comfort in that fact. How do you know? I can feel them, Mira said. They're everywhere else. The junction came up fast. Dara took the left without lifting her foot, felt something scrape along the undercarriage, and then they were pitching nose down on a ramp that shouldn't have been passable and very nearly wasn't T. Russell swore once quietly, in a language Dara didn't recognize. The headlights picked up the bottom of the ramp and she hit the brakes hard, enough to throw them all forward, and they skidded to a stop in what turned out to be a maintenance chamber the size of an aircraft hangar, the ceiling dripping condensation, the floor marked with old painted lines in colors that no longer corresponded to any living system. Silence. Dara cut the engine, put both hands flat on the wheel, and breathed. How long? She said. They're searching the east sectors, Mira said. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 12. Russell was already out of the car, moving along the wall with the economy of motion that old cops never lose. He found a circuit panel, studied it, didn't touch it. He came back and stood beside the driver's door and looked down at Dara. You going to tell me what's happening? He said. I've been telling you what's happening for 3 days. Tell me again. The short version. Dara rested her head against the steering wheel for exactly 2 seconds. Then she sat up and turned to look at him. She was 31 years old, though she felt considerably older. She had a 2-inch scar above her left eyebrow from a creditor enforcement action that had gone wrong 4 years ago, and she'd been off sovereign payroll since the occupation began, and she hadn't slept a consecutive 8 hours in 11 days, and her hands still weren't shaking, which she took as evidence of either impressive discipline or a metabolism that had simply run out of adrenaline to produce. The Varric came to this solar system 22 years ago, she said. Long observation period. Standard survey methodology for their kind. They map every inhabited system before they move on it, find the resource they want, then extract it. Usually the resource is mineral. Sometimes it's atmospheric. They've done it to 43 systems that we know of. What's different about ours? The resource they found here is biological. Specifically, it's a kind of neural architecture that appears very rarely in mammals with high encephalization quotients. The Varric call it a cascade amplifier. It's a structure in the temporal lobe that can, under the right conditions, interface with and amplify psionic field emissions from surrounding individuals. Russell looked at the back seat. She has it, Dara said. Russell looked at Mira. Mira looked back at him with large, serious eyes. She's not the only one, Dara said, but she's the only one left. The others were extracted. The Varric have been running a controlled harvesting program through a human front organization for the last 9 years. Fraud, you know them. Russell's face did something complicated. I worked cases that touched fraud, peripherally. We weren't allowed to pursue, because the sovereignty leadership had been compromised. 12 of your senior commanders were on fraud's payroll. 4 of them knew exactly what fraud was. The others just thought they were taking bribes from a pharmaceutical research company. She paused. The compromised ones are dead now. The others are still alive. For what that's worth. The silence in the chamber had a particular quality, the kind produced by a volume of air that has absorbed a great deal of violence and not yet released it. Mira is a clone, Dara said. She's a genetic construct developed by fraud using the neural blueprint of a woman who died 11 years ago. The woman was the last known natural carrier of the cascade amplifier structure. Fraud made 6 copies and managed to keep 3 of them viable to adolescence. Mira is the last one, and I got her out, said a voice from the corner of the chamber. Dara didn't jump. She'd known he was there. The 6th sense that comes from extended combat proximity is less dramatic than people imagine. It's more like a persistent low-grade awareness. The way you know a room is warmer than it was 5 minutes ago without ever seeing the thermometer move. Kale stepped out of the shadows. He was lean in the way that long illness and harder recovery make a person lean, all tendon and scar tissue, and a quality of attention that doesn't ever fully switch off. He had a vertical scar running from his left jaw down into the collar of his jacket, and his eyes in the poor light of the chamber looked like they'd been installed by someone who'd had the right components, but consulted the wrong diagram. He was also, Dara knew, the most dangerous person in the room by a significant margin, though his biometric readout, if you could take one, would have told you otherwise. Kale, Mira said, and something in her voice changed. Not relaxed, exactly, steadied. He crossed the chamber and crouched in front of the car window and looked at the girl through the glass. His expression was not a tender expression. It was the expression of someone who has decided to protect something, and has made that decision with full understanding of what it will cost. They burned the safe house on Meridian Street, he said to Dara. 2 squads. They're not being quiet anymore. I know. That means they're close. I know that too. He stood and looked at Russell. You're the detective, Russell said. Who are you? I was the man who pulled her out of Fraud's extraction facility 9 months ago. He tilted his head slightly toward the back seat. I've been keeping her alive since. Dara's been keeping me alive since. He said it simply, without sentiment. My name is Kale. That's enough name for now. Russell studied him the way old detectives study everything. Not hostile, not friendly, just comprehensive. You were one of theirs, Russell said. Kale didn't answer, which was an answer. He was a failed experiment, Mira said from the back seat. He was supposed to be like me. But his version of the architecture developed differently. It didn't produce what they wanted. What did it produce? Russell asked. Something they didn't account for, Kale said, which is the only reason I'm still alive. The first tremor hit then, coming up through the floor of the chamber. Not an earthquake, the signature was wrong, too rhythmic, too deliberate, a column of pressure descending in concentric rings from somewhere far above. Seeker pulse, Dara said. They all knew what that meant. The Varric weren't searching anymore. The Varric had something to search with. Mira pressed her forehead against the car window, and her breath fogged the glass, and Dara watched the child's face go still in a way that should not have been possible for a 7-year-old's face. The stillness of something much older wearing a child's features. They brought a chorus drone, Mira said. It's 3 levels up. Can you mask us? Kale asked her. For a while. The girl's voice was entirely without drama. It depends on how close they get. Then we need to move before they get close. He straightened and looked at Dara. The route through the thermal vents is still clear. I checked it an hour ago. An hour is a long time. Yes. He picked up the bag that had been sitting at his feet. Dara hadn't noticed it, which said something, and slung it over one shoulder. It is. The 4 of them moved. The thermal vent system of the city was legacy infrastructure from the original settlement construction, the kind of thing that gets built into the bones of a place, and then forgotten by every authority, except the people who need to move through it, without being seen. It smelled of old metal and warm stone. The temperature was 40 degrees above the surface and climbing. Russell had taken off his jacket within the first 5 minutes and was breathing through his nose with the careful discipline of someone who has run in worse conditions and learned from it. Mira walked between Kale and Dara, her small hand in Kale's large one, not because she was afraid, but because the contact seemed to matter for reasons none of them entirely understood. Dara had a theory, the cascade amplifier structure, as the Varric xenobiologists had eventually determined after decades of analysis, didn't just amplify external psionic fields, it created them. The child was a living broadcast tower for a signal that most human nervous systems couldn't consciously detect, but that all human nervous systems responded to at the neurochemical level. This was why Fraud had wanted her. This was why the Varric had wanted Fraud. A living cascade amplifier of sufficient development could, theoretically, synchronize every human mind within a several-kilometer radius into a single coherent field of awareness. The Varric's term for this was harvest ready. Their word for what came after was the one that didn't translate into any human language, because human languages had never needed a word for it. What Dara's theory was, the one she hadn't told anyone yet, not even Kyle, was that the Varric had miscalculated something fundamental about the process they were attempting to facilitate. They'd treated the Cascade Amplifier as a tool, as a mechanism, something you could extract from its biological context, replicate in controlled conditions, and deploy at industrial scale. They had not, as far as Dara could determine, ever actually considered what it was for. The evolutionary pressure that had produced the structure in the first place was not military. It was not strategic. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. It was the thing that lets a parent know their child is afraid without hearing a sound. It was the thing that causes three strangers separated by a wall to laugh at the same moment. It was the thing that makes grief communicable across a room, makes joy contagious, makes the sight of one person's courage shore up the failing courage of everyone around them. It was connection, and you could not weaponize the architecture of connection without first understanding what connection actually did. The Varric didn't understand what connection did. Their civilization had evolved past it 3 million years ago. That was, Dara believed, their most critical error, one they were not going to understand until it was far too late. The vent system opened at the base of the thermal exchange plant on the east shore of the estuary, in a room full of cooling equipment the size of orbital launch vehicles, all of it running on automation, none of it under fraud surveillance, because no sane person would have run an operation through a space that was technically venting 300-degree steam every 40 seconds. They had learned to time the intervals. Russell went first because he asked to, which surprised Dara and seemed to surprise him as well. He timed the steam column with the economical precision of a man who has spent considerable time in environments that could kill him and has learned to treat them with the appropriate professional respect. He moved across the chamber in 3 smooth bursts, each perfectly calibrated to the ventilation interval, and arrived at the far door without any particular drama. Kale went next, carrying Mira against his chest with one arm, moving the way people move who have been specifically designed to move quickly, and who have then spent considerable time transcending the design. There was something slightly wrong about how he moved. Dara had always noticed it. A fluidity that exceeded the mechanical, as though the architecture of his body knew something his conscious mind didn't, and simply expressed it whenever the occasion arose. Dara went last. She was 2/3 of the way across when the interval shifted. The maintenance system had been running on the same cycle for 11 years. At some point in the preceding hour, a pressure sensor in the 3rd exchange column had malfunctioned, and the compensating algorithm had adjusted the cycle by 6 seconds. 6 seconds. She heard the pressure release begin, and she ran, not toward the door, which was too far, toward the nearest exchange column, which was 8 feet to her left, and had a maintenance ladder that went straight up the side to a walkway above the steam vent level. She hit the ladder at full speed and climbed by instinct, grabbing rungs without looking, driven up by the sound of imminent superheated death below her. The steam hit 15 feet below where she stopped, a white column of force that would have stripped skin down to bone, and she hung on the ladder above it and waited for it to stop, and when it stopped, she climbed back down and crossed the rest of the chamber and went through the door. Kale and Russell and Mira were on the other side. All 3 of them were looking at her. She looked back. The algorithm adjusted, she said. Nobody said anything. I'm fine. Yes, Kale said. Let's keep moving. They moved. The rendezvous point was a mid-century transit hub that had been decommissioned when the Varric-aligned Transportation Authority absorbed the Sovereignty Rail Network and shut down the non-profitable lines, which had been most of them. It was 8 levels below street grade, accessible through 3 approaches that Dara had scouted herself, and it contained, stored in a compartment behind the original station manager's office, a signal array that could, under the right conditions, broadcasting on a frequency that the Varric had been specifically told by Fraud's liaison office was a defunct industrial band that produced nothing but thermal noise, reach a receiver currently orbiting at a distance of approximately 1.2 million kilometers. The receiver was a ship. The ship had a crew of 3. The crew were the last surviving members of an organization that had no official name and very few surviving members, which made the organizational structure elegantly simple. They needed to reach the hub. They needed to stay alive for the approximately 46 minutes it would take for the ship to reposition after signal receipt. They needed, at some point, to deal with the chorus drone that Mira had identified 3 levels above. These were the three problems. They had between them a former sovereignty detective with a broken-down semi-automatic and 31 years of professional stubbornness, a failed Varric experiment who exceeded the design parameters in ways that the designers had not anticipated and could not fully quantify, a child who was also a broadcast tower for the most ancient human frequency there was, and Dara Voss, who was 31 years old and had a scar above her left eyebrow and hands that still weren't shaking, and who had a theory about how the next hour was going to go. The theory was this: the Varric were going to make one final mistake. They were going to get close enough that the chorus drone could do what it was designed to do. And when it did, they were going to discover that the amplification they had spent 9 years trying to harvest was already complete. Not in the controlled, clinical, extractable form they had designed for, but in the only form it had ever naturally occurred: untidy, unpredictable, bounded by affection rather than architecture, and radiating outward from a 7-year-old girl who loved the man who'd kept her alive, and who had spent 9 months absorbing everything in his long, complicated wreckage of a history, and who had been gradually, without Fraud's knowledge or the Varric comprehension, threading that frequency through every connected nervous system within the broadcasting range of her considerable and still growing power. The Varric were going to attempt to initiate a harvest, and they were going to discover that the field had already been seeded, just not in the direction they had intended. The transit hub was intact. Dara had been afraid it wouldn't be, afraid that Fraud had found the one approach she hadn't scouted, that the arrays had been seized, that the three in the ship had gone silent for a reason that was bad, rather than merely complicated. But the hub was intact, and the compartment was sealed, and when Russell found the station manager's office and Dara opened the panel behind the original scheduling board, the array was still there. A compact, unremarkable piece of hardware that looked like surplus communication equipment from 3 generations back, which was exactly what it was, because some kinds of unremarkability are a form of camouflage so old it has become invisible. She had it powered up in 4 minutes. Kale stood at the entrance to the hub and watched the corridors. He'd done this every hour of every day for 9 months, standing watch with the specific quality of attention that people develop when the cost of inattention is the death of someone who depends on them. It didn't look dramatic from the outside. It looked like a man standing in a corridor, which was the point. Mira had found a bench near the old departure board and was sitting on it with her feet not quite reaching the floor, examining the back of her own hand with the serious and slightly unfocused expression of someone reading something printed in very small type. This was not an unusual thing for her to do. Her relationship with her own nervous system was more interactive than most people's. Russell was sitting beside her on the bench. He had a small flask in his jacket pocket, and he was turning it over and over in his hands without opening it. This, too, was a thing Dara had noticed. The flask was always turning but was never opened. She'd asked him about it once, and he'd said it was the motion, not the contents, that he needed. She understood this more than she'd expected to. Signals locked, she called. Kale didn't turn around. Transit time? 41 minutes if Shen pushes the drive. 52 conservative. Tell her to push it. Dara sent the signal. The next 11 minutes were quiet. The kind of quiet that accumulates weight as it extends, as if silence is a substance that thickens with time. The hub breathed around them, old air, old stone, the ghost of 100,000 ordinary departures that had happened in this space before the world changed, and ordinary departures became something you remembered rather than something you planned. It was Mira who spoke. They found the entrance, not alarmed, informative, the tone of a weather service advising of conditions. Kale moved from the entrance without urgency, crossed to the center of the hub, and turned to face the 3 entry corridors. He stood very still. His forehead, which was unmarked, because the modification Fraud had performed on him was imperfect, because the display architecture that Varric science had spent decades developing had not properly instantiated in his biology the way it was supposed to, because he was, technically speaking, a defect, a failed product, a number that never got above 5 even when the situation had empirically warranted a higher number. His forehead was unmarked. Dara had seen what it looked like when he used the thing that the modification had inadvertently produced instead of the thing it was supposed to produce. She had seen it twice. Both times she had understood afterward why Fraud had considered him a failure and thrown him away, because what he had was not what they'd made him for, and what he had was considerably more interesting. How many, he said. 17, Mira said. Plus the drone. Where's the drone? Above. She looked up at the ceiling. It's coming down. The first Fraud operative came through the east corridor, and Kale was already moving when the man S-Foot cleared the entrance arch, not toward him, sideways, to a position that put the support column between them, and then he did something with his hands that was not psionic in the Varric sense, was not the directed telekinetic force that Fraud had been trying to breed into their operatives for 15 years, was something altogether different, something that had no number on the Varric scale, because the Varric scale only measured one kind of output. And this was a different kind entirely. What it looked like, from where Dara was standing, was nothing. A shimmer, maybe. A slight visual distortion, like heat off summer pavement. What it did was communicate. The operative who came through the east arch stopped moving. Not because he was stunned or struck or psionic blasted to the ground the way Fraud's fighters were trained to fight. He stopped because something inside him, the same architecture that was inside everyone, the same primate social circuitry that was so ancient it ran under cognition rather than through it, received a transmission, and the transmission was simple and total and carried the emotional weight of absolute certainty. And the certainty was this: you are on the wrong side of this. It was not a command. It was not a persuasion. It was the same thing that passes between two people who have both survived the same disaster and find themselves looking at each other across a ruined room. Pure shared recognition, the understanding that runs beneath language and ideology and allegiance, the thing that cannot be faked because it is not a statement but a state. The operative stood in the arch of the east corridor, and a look came over his face that Dara had seen on the other two occasions and still could not name precisely. It was not confusion, not peace, not conversion. It was something closer to what happens when you've been arguing a position for a long time and someone shows you a piece of evidence so simple and so undeniable that the argument simply loses its gravity and falls away. He sat down on the floor of the transit hub. Behind him, two more operatives came through and stopped. In the west corridor, three more came to the entrance and did not come through. The drone was different. The drone was not human. It came down through the ceiling, through a maintenance shaft that had evidently widened to accommodate its passage, and it was approximately the size and shape of a large office copier machine, if that machine had been designed by a species for whom form was strictly subordinate to function and for whom function had nothing to do with comfort. It moved on 4 articulated ground contact points, and it had 7 sensor arrays arranged in a crown above its primary housing, and it made no sound that human hearing could detect, but the air pressure around it changed in ways that Dara felt at the base of her skull and the backs of her knees. It was called a chorus drone because of what it did. It synchronized. It was a Varric-engineered device whose function was to entrain any active cascade amplifier signal with the Varric collective frequency, converting the amplifier's natural broadcast from whatever it happened to be broadcasting into the specific resonant pattern that the Varric could use. In practical terms, it was the device that turned the most important thing about Mira into the most dangerous thing about Mira, or was supposed to. It oriented on her immediately. Its sensor crown rotated and locked. The air pressure changed again, more severely, and Dara's nose began to bleed, just slightly. And Russell put one hand on Mira's shoulder without seeming to think about it, and the flask in his other hand stopped turning. Mira looked at the drone looked at Mira. And then something happened that was not in the Varric operational manual for Chorus Drone, deployment not in any of the mission parameters that had been communicated to Fraud's extraction teams, not in any of the 43 prior harvest-ready assessments that the Varric Survey Division had filed in the 3 million years of their civilization's history. The drone found the signal it was looking for. It was there. The cascade amplifier was active and broadcasting exactly as the drone's sensors had been calibrated to detect. The signal strength was significantly higher than any prior recorded measurement. Higher, in fact, than the Varric theoretical maximum, which meant the measurement instruments were either malfunctioning or the theoretical maximum required revision. The drone began the entrainment process, and it found the signal already contained a carrier frequency. This was not supposed to be possible. The natural cascade amplifier signal was supposed to be undirected noise, an ambient broadcast with no encoded content, a pure field emission that the Varric procedure would then organize into a coherent pattern. That was the entire premise of the harvest operation. The field had to be blank to be written on. The field was not blank. The field was full, not of psionic content in any Varric classifiable sense, not of directed force or organized power or anything that the Varric scale had categories for. What the drone's entrainment process encountered was something its architecture had never been designed to process. The complete, uncompressed, radically undisciplined contents of 9 months of a 7-year-old girl's extraordinary attention. The attention of a child who had spent 3 million years worth of her species' evolution compressed into 9 months of accelerated development, absorbing everything she encountered, and who had developed an intense and unsystematic interest in the people around her. In Kale, who hummed the same 5-bar melody when he was thinking and didn't know he was doing it. A tune his mother had hummed when she was nervous, which she had done a great deal, which was why it had lodged in him, and why he carried it, the way you carry things you don't know you're carrying. In Russell, who had worked 41 homicide cases in his career and remembered every victim's name, and who turned the flask over and over, not because he wanted a drink, but because his husband had given him the flask the morning he'd shipped out for his first tour, and the flask was 23 years old and had outlasted the marriage and 4 city governments, and was the most stable object in Russell's life. In Dara, who had a theory she hadn't told anyone yet, and who had been right about more important things more often than she'd been, wrong, and whose hands didn't shake, and who had been keeping impossible things alive through sheer disciplined refusal to accept alternative outcomes for long enough that the refusal had calcified into a form of faith. All of this was in the signal, plus the stray cat that had lost half its tail to the topology wall 3 months ago, when the topology wall had briefly existed, which Mira had subsequently named Archive and carried in a bag whenever they moved, and which was currently sitting in KL's jacket pocket, expressing opinions about the current situation in the direct and unambiguous way that cats express opinions. The drone's entrainment process encountered all of this and attempted to override it with the Varric collective frequency, which was the frequency of 3 million years of perfect, sterile, non-individuated coordination, and which was, as the Varric had always known and were quite proud of, the most powerful organizing signal in the mapped galaxy. The drone ran the entrainment process, and the Varric collective frequency bounced. Not because it was blocked, not because it was overpowered, because the carrier signal it was attempting to overwrite was not a signal at all, in any technical sense. It was a relationship, and you cannot overwrite a relationship with a frequency because they are not the same category of thing. The Varric had spent 3 million years evolving beyond the need for individual connection, and in doing so had also evolved beyond the ability to recognize it when they encountered it, the way a species that has evolved past the need for sight will eventually lose not just the eyes, but the capacity to understand what eyes were for. The drone processed this for approximately 2 seconds. Then it sent a query to the primary Varric survey vessel in high orbit. The survey vessel's command architecture received the query and processed it. The processing took 11 seconds. Then it escalated to the subcollective. The subcollective took 41 seconds. Then it escalated to the regional collective. The regional collective took significantly longer, which was unusual, because the regional collective had not escalated anything to a higher authority in approximately 800 years. The query was simple. It contained the drone's sensor data, the entrainment attempt log, the signal analysis from the Cascade Amplifier broadcast, and a single request for clarification on a concept that the regional collective's vast encyclopedic knowledge of 43 harvested systems and 3 million years of operational history did not contain a working definition for. The concept was, what is the word for the thing that makes the signal unwritable? High in the sky above the transit hub, in a ship that was just now beginning to reposition for a rescue extraction, and whose crew of 3 were watching the orbital signatures above them, with the professional intensity of people who are very good at their jobs, and very aware that good is sometimes not quite enough, the regional collective query traveled upward and outward and did not receive an answer for 17 hours. In the transit hub, Dara was watching the drone. The drone had stopped moving. Its sensor arrays had retracted by approximately 12%. This was the first time she had ever seen a Varric-deployed piece of equipment display anything that could be interpreted as hesitation, and she understood, looking at it, that the theory she'd been holding for 3 weeks was not a theory anymore. Mira, she said. I know, Mira said. How long can you hold it? Mira considered this question with the thoroughness she gave to all questions. She was still sitting on the bench. Her feet still didn't reach the floor. Archive the cat had climbed out of Kale's pocket at some point and was now sitting beside her, expressing the specific cat opinion that the situation had been adequately handled and it was time for something to eat. I don't think I'm holding it, Mira said. I think it's just what it is. The fraud operatives had not left the hub. They were sitting on the floor or standing against walls, some of them talking to each other in low voices, some of them not talking at all of them with that same expression, the one Dara still couldn't name. The one that looked like the moment an argument loses its gravity and falls away. Russell was sitting beside Mira again. He'd opened the flask. He was not drinking from it. He had set it upright on the bench between them, and he and Mira were both looking at it with the slightly meditative quality of people who have made peace with something important and are now simply present in the aftermath. Kale was standing near the entrance, still watching the corridors. The ship will be here in 9 minutes, Dara said. He didn't turn around. I know, he said. She crossed the hub and stood beside him. The corridor was empty. The sounds from outside, the Varric operational sounds, the search and extraction sounds, the sounds of a civilizational machinery that had been running on the same parameters for 3 million years, had changed in quality. They hadn't stopped, but they changed. Did you know she could do that? Dara asked. No. Did you know you could do what you did? To the operatives? A pause. Not at that scale. No. But you knew it was possible. I knew it was what I had instead of what they wanted me to have. He glanced sideways at her. It was a very brief glance, but it contained a considerable amount of information. I didn't know it was the same thing. The same thing as what she has. The same thing as what any of us has. He looked back at the corridor. I just have more of it than I'm supposed to, because of what they did to me. And because of he paused. Look back at the hub, at the child on the bench, at the flask standing upright between the old detective and the 7-year-old at the cat. Because of her, he said, the ship was a salvage sovereignty scout vessel, stripped down and rebuilt 3 times, with a hull that was technically illegal under Varric-administered interstellar transit law, and a drive that could do things that the ship's original designers had not anticipated, and which the current crew had learned to treat with the relationship that professionals develop with tools that exceed the parameters they were designed for. Deep respect, no complacency, constant attention. It came down in the estuary. Not on the estuary, it displaced approximately 900 cubic meters of water and settled at an angle on the riverbed with enough structural violence to crack several non-critical hull components, and the kind of landing that the crew of 3 had clearly executed before and were clearly not happy about executing again. Shen was out of the hatch before the ship had fully stopped moving. She was 50 years old and had been navigating ships of one kind or another since she was 15 and had the hands to prove it. Knuckled and scarred, and in perpetual motion as if stillness was something she rationed. I broke the starboard strut landing, she said. I heard, Dara said. I can fix it. She was already looking at the others, counting, assessing. Is this everyone? This is everyone. Shen's eyes landed on Mira and stayed there for a moment. She didn't say anything. Then she looked at Kale. You're Kale. Yes. Dara described you. He looked at Dara. Accurately, Shen said. Move. They moved. The transit hub had 17 fraud operatives in it when they left. None of them tried to stop the departure. Several of them helped. 2 of them asked, in a way that was more pragmatic than dramatic, whether there was room on the ship. There was not. But Shen took their identifiers and the coordinates of 3 safe transit points and told them, in the flat professional tone of someone making a commitment they intend to keep, that she would be back. The ship's interior smelled of recycled air and old hydrostatic seals, and a particular brand of coffee substitute that had not been commercially available for 3 years, which meant someone on board had been hoarding it, which Dara noted as evidence of both excellent planning and admirable priorities. Mira was given a seat that reclined and told she should sleep, and she said she wasn't tired, and within 4 minutes she was asleep. With Archive, the cat arranged on her chest in the posture of a cat who has determined that nothing further requires his input. Russell sat across from her and opened his flask and didn't drink from it and turned it in his hands and looked out the viewport at the water rushing past as the ship clawed upward through the estuary and then through the lower atmosphere and then higher. The drone was still in the transit hub, Dara knew, still processing, still waiting for the regional collective to return with a definition for the thing it had encountered. The Varric survey vessel in high orbit tracked the departing ship for 11 minutes before its sensor array, inexplicably, without any recorded cause, lost the contact signature. This was not because the ship had engaged any kind of stealth technology. The ship's stealth capacity was severely limited, owing to the 3 prior rebuilds and certain components that Shen had sourced from places that did not ask questions but also did not provide warranties. The contact signature was lost because one of the Varric sensor operators had stopped paying attention for 11 critical seconds, not because of inattention, because of a sudden and inexplicable awareness of a signal they hadn't noticed before, faint, beneath the operational frequencies, carried on what the sensor logs would later record as thermal noise from a defunct industrial band. A signal with no content that the Varric sensor architecture could classify. A signal whose only measurable characteristic was that it was old and persistent and radiated outward from the third planet in this unremarkable system in all directions equally. It felt, and this was the word that the operator would later use in their report, to the considerable confusion of their supervisors, like something they had forgotten. They had not, technically, forgotten it. Their civilization had evolved past it 3 million years ago. The distinction was subtle, and, for the Varric, turned out to be extremely important. The ship broke atmosphere. The stars came in clean through the viewport. Dara was at the navigation console, with Shen running calculations. They had a destination. It was not close. It was also not far by the standards of the problem they were solving. The problem required 3 things: time, which they had in modest supply, resources which they had in inadequate supply, and an understanding of something that no prior civilization, in the recorded history of this region of the galaxy, had ever survived long enough to demonstrate that the species most dangerous to encounter was not the one with the most power, that the measurement of power by the Varric scale, by any scale of force or reach or individual capacity, had always missed the point, that the most dangerous species to encounter was the one that couldn't be processed by your measurement instruments, because your measurement instruments had been designed to measure the things your civilization considered important, and this species had developed its most important capacity in a direction that your civilization had abandoned before your measurement instruments were invented. You haven't slept, Shen said, not looking up from her console. I know, you should. There are things to figure out first. There are always things to figure out. Lying down doesn't stop you figuring. She did look up then, briefly. Your theory, does it work? Dara thought about the drone, frozen in the transit hub, about the operatives sitting on the floor with their gravity-free expressions, about the Varric sensor operator who had stopped paying attention for 11 seconds. Yes, she said. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything. But yes. Shen nodded once, with the economical approval of someone who trusts precision over confidence and considers appropriate uncertainty to be a form of competence. Sleep, she said. 2 hours. Then you can be unsure of things. Dara slept. She dreamed of the tunnel and the car, and the child's small fingers touching the back of her neck. She dreamed of the steam rising in white columns, and the cold feel of the maintenance, ladder, and the specific quality of silence in the chamber below. She dreamed, briefly and without any particular narrative logic, of a 5-bar melody she had never heard but recognized. She woke 2 hours later, and the stars were different outside the viewport, and Kale was standing at the far end of the compartment, watching Mira sleep, and Archive the cat was watching him back. She did it on purpose, Dara said. Not a question. Some of it, Kale said. The rest is just what she is. And the rest of us. He was quiet for a moment. The Varric spent 3 million years getting more powerful. They got better at every single thing they decided to measure. He watched the sleeping child. They just decided to stop measuring this. And we didn't. We couldn't. It's the thing that makes us work. You can't evolve past it without falling apart. He paused. Or maybe you can. Maybe that's what they are. Something that held together long enough to get very powerful and then started falling apart, so slowly they didn't notice. Dara thought about this. She thought about the 43 systems, the 43 harvests, the 43 civilizations that had encountered the Varric and not survived the encounter. She thought about what 44 was going to look like. The regional collective is going to respond, she said. Eventually, they're going to figure out what happened in the transit hub, and they're going to send something larger. Yes, we need to be ready for that. Yes, what we did tonight isn't a weapon. It's not repeatable on command. We can't just line up trained personnel and broadcast at them. No, he was still watching Mira. But we don't have to. Tell me why. He turned from the viewport for the first time, and in the ambient light of the ship's interior, his face had the quality that faces sometimes have after long and considered thought on an important matter, not resolved exactly, but settled. The difference between a decision and a conclusion. The drone didn't fail because Mira's signal was stronger than theirs, he said. It failed because their process requires a blank field, an unoccupied carrier, something they can write on. What they encountered in that hub wasn't blank. It was full. He let a beat pass. It was full because she'd had 9 months. 9 months of connecting, of caring about specific people, learning specific things, accumulating all of this. He gestured slightly, encompassing something too large for the gesture and transmitting it constantly, because that's what she is. And if every cascade amplifier they try to activate encounters the same thing, Every one of them will, because the signal propagates. She's not the source of it, she's the amplifier. The source is the same thing it's always been. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to a full smile, but it made it further than most expressions he'd produced in Dara's presence. The source is everyone who's been in a room with her for more than 20 minutes. Dara sat with this for a while. Outside the viewport, the stars kept moving. In the rear compartment, Russell was asleep across 2 seats with his jacket over his face and the flask in his hand. In the forward compartment, Shen was doing 3 things at once with the quiet competence of someone who has been doing 3 things at once for 35 years. On Mira's chest, Archive the cat exhaled once, deeply, and adjusted his position by 2 inches, and went back to sleep. She'll need more time, Dara said. More people, more connections, more signal in the carrier. Yes. And the Varric are going to figure out what's happening. Yes. Before we're ready. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was with the flat certainty of someone who has not calculated optimism, but has calculated the only available path forward and found it. If not comfortable, at least traversable. We're already ready, he said. We've always been ready. We just didn't know what for. 3 days later, the regional collective issued its response to the drone's query. It was the longest official deliberation in the regional collective's 800-year independent operational history. The response came in 5 parts, each one longer than the last, each one containing escalating levels of qualificatory language that was unusual in a civilization that had spent 3 million years being extremely clear about things. The first part was a revised definition of the anomalous signal type. The definition contained 17 subclasses and 3 provisional categories, and an explicit admission that all 17 subclasses and 3 provisional categories were inadequate. The second part was a revised operational protocol for chorus drone deployment in the target system. The revision contained 49 new contingency parameters, and a note that the contingency parameters were provisional pending further assessment. The third part was a withdrawal order for all ground-level fraud assets in the target planet's northern hemisphere. The withdrawal was described as operational reconfiguration. The fourth part was a request, not a command, which was itself unprecedented, for additional survey data on the target civilization's historical development pattern, with specific focus on what the document termed effective infrastructure, a category that had not previously existed in any Varric survey methodology. The fifth part was a 3-word addendum, appended without context or explanation, which the Varric's own translation matrix rendered into human language as, "What have we missed?" Aboard the scout ship, crossing the cold middle distance between planets, Shen read the intercepted transmission and handed it to Dara without comment. Dara read it. She thought about it for a long time. Then she went back to where Mira was awake and sitting cross-legged on her bunk, examining Archive with the focused attention of a doctor and the delight of a child, which were not incompatible things. They sent a question, Dara said. Mira looked up. They want to know what they missed. Mira turned this over. Are you going to answer them? I'm thinking about it. What are you going to say? Dara sat down on the edge of the bunk. The ship made its quiet mechanical sounds around them. Russell was in the forward compartment arguing cheerfully with Shen about the most efficient method of breaching a specific class of Varric security, perimeter. Kale was standing watch at the aft hatch, which was not necessary at this altitude and in this trajectory, but which he did anyway, out of the same unshakable habit that keeps people alive through the stretches where nothing is coming for them. I'm going to tell them, Dara said slowly, that they've been measuring power in only one direction for 3 million years. That power in the other direction. The kind that doesn't scale linearly, that doesn't have a number, that doesn't show up on any sensor array they've built, has been accumulating in this system for as long as we've been a species. That it's not a weapon, and it can't be pointed. That it's not a shield, and it can't be hardened. That it's not a signal, and it can't be jammed. Mira was watching her, and that, Dara said, they are welcome to keep coming. And every time they come, they'll find more of it. Not because we're building something, because we can't help it, because it's what we do. We connect, we accumulate, we pass things forward, we remember each other's names. She paused. We carry flasks that outlast marriages because the weight of the thing matters more than the contents. She stopped talking. Mira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with perfect seriousness, Archive would like something to eat. Dara laughed. It was a short laugh, and not particularly musical, and Archive looked at her with the expression of a cat who finds laughter to be a poor substitute for food. But it was genuine, and it moved through the small space of the cabin like heat through metal, and in the forward compartment, Russell paused mid-argument and smiled without knowing why, and Shen's hands kept moving, but the tension in her shoulders changed quality, and Kale, standing at the aft hatch, heard it and turned toward it, and the 5-bar melody played once in the back of his mind, his mother's melody, the one he carried without knowing he carried it. He hadn't told Mira about that melody. She had known it for 6 months. The Varric did not receive an answer to their 5-part communique. They had not expected one precisely, but the absence was noted. The absence, and the fact that their updated sensor sweeps of the target planet's northern hemisphere were returning an unusual and persistent signal on a band that their survey methodology had categorized as thermal noise. The signal was not thermal noise. The signal did not match any known psionic frequency in their database. The signal did not match any known technological broadcast pattern. The signal matched if the Varric sensor analysts were to be precise about it, and they were always precise. Nothing in their 3-million-year archive of encountered phenomena. It was old, it was persistent, it radiated equally in all directions from no single point of origin. It was increasing in strength. And it had, in the 43 hours since the transit hub incident, spread across the entirety of the third planet's surface, and had begun, faintly but measurably, to propagate outward. The regional collective called a second deliberation. The second deliberation lasted 6 days. During those 6 days, the scout ship reached its destination, a large asteroid with a stable orbit and an interior space that had been modified, carefully and over a period of years, into the kind of place where human beings could survive indefinitely and work continuously on problems of the kind they were working on. The modifications were not comfortable, but they were livable. And livable, Dara had always believed, was the operative standard. They brought Mira aboard. They set Archive up with a food source and a specific elevated platform that the cat immediately co-opted as a surveillance position from which the entire common area could be observed and judged. They ran the signals analysis on the 5-part communique 3 times and confirmed the translation of the 5th part on every run. What have we missed? Russell pinned it to the wall above his workstation. He did this without explanation. When Dara asked him about it later, he thought for a moment and then said, 43 systems, 43 civilizations, and then they run into ours and they don't know what they missed. He touched the printout with one finger lightly, the way you touch a thing you want to remember. 43 times, nobody made them ask that question. We're the first. He looked at her. I want to see it every day. Kale had, in the 3 days of transit, done something that Dara had not expected and that she suspected he had not expected either. He had talked, not strategically, not informationally, not in the precise and efficient vocabulary of operational necessity. He had talked the way people talk when they've been not talking for a long time. And something has changed the pressure in the system. He'd talked about the facility where fraud had made him, and the years after, and the specific way the world looks to a person who's been designed to be useful and has turned out to be useful in the wrong direction. He'd talked about finding Mira and the 9 months and the humming he did without knowing he was doing it. Mira, sitting across from him in the mess compartment, eating something from a thermal pouch with the unhurried focus of a child who takes food seriously, had said, your mother hummed when she was worried about you. It's the same tune. He had stopped talking. How do you know that? He said. I know lots of things about you. That's not a comforting thing to say. It's true, though. She spooned more food. She thought about you a lot. The version of the thought she sent, Mira paused. Looking for the right with the careful, linguistic precision she brought to things that mattered. It was warm. It's still warm. I don't know how thoughts can still be warm when people are gone, but they can. She looked up at him. Yours are the warmest ones I have. He had not said anything for a while after that, but the quality of his silence had changed. The second Varric deliberation concluded, and the conclusion was transmitted through channels that the scout ship's sensor array should not have been able to intercept, and which it intercepted anyway, because Shen had modified the array 3 times, and knew things about Varric transmission protocols that the Varric were not aware a human engineer could know. The conclusion was this: operational suspension, target system, third planet, duration, indefinite. Reason signal classification failure, all assets to holding pattern, request for external review from primary collective. The primary collective had not reviewed a regional matter in approximately 2,000 years. The request had been sent. Dara read the intercept twice. Then she went to find Kale. He was in the workshop, doing something with a component from the aft hatch systems that he'd evidently decided required maintenance. This was, Dara had come to understand, what he did when he was thinking. He found a piece of machinery and attended to it with great care and precision, And while his hands were doing that, his mind was doing something else. They've suspended operations, she said. He didn't stop working. How long? Indefinite. Pending external review. How long is that? I don't know. The regional collective's been autonomous for 2,000 years. The primary collective's involvement could take. She thought about the scale of it. A long time. He set down the component and looked at her. Long enough? It depends what we do with it. What do you want to do with it? Dara had been thinking about this since the transit hub, since the drone in the hub, since the 5-part communique and the 3 words at the end of it. She'd been thinking about 43 systems and the question that none of them had managed to make the Varek ask. She had a theory. She'd had it for 3 weeks and had been not saying it for almost as long. She said it now. They've spent 3 million years mapping power, and they've never mapped this. They don't have the vocabulary for it. They sent a question because they genuinely don't know what they encountered, and their classification systems are failing them. She met his eyes. What if we answered? He was very still, not as a negotiation, not as a petition, not as a request for mercy, or a demonstration of strength. She kept going an answer, a genuine one. We tell them what they missed. We describe it. We define it in terms they can process. We give them the vocabulary. Why? Because 43 systems are gone. Because we're the first one that made them ask the question. Because the question means something opened in them that wasn't open before. She took a breath. And because if they understand it even partially, even theoretically, even as an abstract concept, then we're not the only species in this region of the galaxy that has it. We become the species that gave it to them. The silence in the workshop had the quality of a very large decision being considered. They came here to consume us, he said. Yes, you want to teach them. I want to answer their question. What they do with the answer is up to them. She paused. But the kind of civilization that has been doing what they've been doing for 3 million years and then asks, what have we missed with genuine uncertainty? That's not a civilization at the end of its capacity for change. That's a civilization at the beginning of a question it doesn't have tools for yet. He looked at the component in his hand, put it down, picked it up again. Mira, he said. Yes, she'll want to be part of it. She's the part that makes it work. He was quiet for a long moment. Your theory, he said. 3 weeks ago, you said you had one, and you hadn't told anyone. I've been telling you now. This is the whole thing? This is most of it. What's the rest? She looked at him steadily. The rest is that I think the architecture that produces the cascade amplifier affect the thing the Varek have been trying to harvest and weaponize. I don't think it's rare. I think the Varek classified it as rare because they were looking for it in its most powerful expression. But I think it's present in every human brain in some form at some level. I think it's the thing we run on. The thing we've been running on since we were standing in dark places around fires, trying to survive winters we weren't built for. She stopped. He was looking at her. And I think the reason the Varek's chorus drone couldn't process what it encountered in that hub isn't because the signal was too strong, she said. It's because the signal was everywhere, not just in Mira, in everyone present. You, Russell, the operatives on the floor, even the drone itself at some level, because it had been in close proximity to the signal for long enough that... She stopped again. He was very still. That's not in any of the technical documentation, he said. No. You think the drone... I think the drone's entrainment process ran in 2 directions, she said. I think it was attempting to overwrite the carrier signal and simultaneously being written on by it. I think the Varek are going to find, when they run diagnostics on the drone, that its internal classification architecture has been modified in ways they won't immediately be able to explain. A very long silence. They're going to want to take the drone apart, he said. Yes. And when they do, they'll find the question they sent us is already partly answered. In the drone's own processing logs. He looked at her for a long time. Then he set the component down on the workbench with great deliberateness, the way you set something down when you've reached the end of the pretense that your hands needed something to do. You've been carrying all of this, he said. Someone has to carry things. That's not... He stopped. Tried again. You should have said. I'm saying now. The workshop was small and warm from the ship's heat exchange system and smelled of machine oil and the specific dry metallic smell of regularly maintained equipment in a confined space, which was, Dara thought, one of the most reassuring smells she knew. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, we answer their question. She exhaled. And then what? He said. And then we see what a 3 million-year-old civilization does when it's shown something it's never seen before. That's not a plan. It's the beginning of one. He almost smiled again. This time it made it further than before. Not a full smile, still, but unmistakably moving in that direction. The kind of movement that, given time and the right conditions, tends to arrive where it's going. The beginning of one, he said. All right. Mira was in the common area when they came out of the workshop, sitting at the table with a tablet and a cup of something warm archive arranged across her feet like a structural support element. She looked up when they entered, with the particular attentiveness that she brought to moments she had already perceived were important. You're going to answer them, she said. Not a question. Yes, Dara said. Mira looked at her steadily. What do you need me to do? Exactly what you've been doing. Just be what I am. Yes. The child considered this. She looked at the tablet and the cup and archive across her feet. She looked at the workshop door and Kale standing in it, and Russell's workstation at the far end of the room where the three-word printout was pinned above the clutter of operational documents, and the flask standing upright between the communication terminal and the coffee substitute that Shen had been hoarding for 3 years. She looked at all of it with the attentiveness she brought to things she wanted to remember. Okay, she said. The message that Dara composed over the following 16 hours was 412 words long. It was sent on the same band the Varric had classified as defunct industrial thermal noise, at a signal strength that was technically beyond the scout ship's rated capacity, and which Shen achieved through a modification that she described, with the particular professional pride of someone who has done a thing that should not have been possible as creative. The message said, "You asked what you missed. Here is what you missed. And here is why you missed it. And here is why it matters." It described, in the precise and careful language of a person who has spent 3 weeks thinking very hard about something difficult, the architecture of human connection, the evolutionary history of it, the neurological basis of it, the way it operates below consciousness and through consciousness and despite consciousness and occasionally in complete defiance of it, the way it cannot be extracted from its biological context, because it is not a structure within the biology, but a property of the biology in relation to other biology. The way it is not a signal but a state. The way it cannot be amplified by being removed from its source, but only by being placed in proximity to more sources. The way it has been accumulating in the third planet's biosphere for approximately 300,000 years. The way the cascade amplifier that the Varric had been trying to harvest was not a rare mutation, but the measurable high end of a distribution that ran at varying levels through every member of the species. The way the reason 43 prior civilizations had not made the Varric ask this question was not that those civilizations had been weaker, but that the Varric had encountered them later. After the signals had been disrupted, the architectures destabilized, the connections severed by conflict and fear, and that the Varric's own presence had been doing this in the target system until a set of specific circumstances had preserved enough of the signal in a specific location for long enough that it had done what it naturally does when allowed to accumulate. It had filled the available space. The message ended with 3 words. They were not the same 3 words the Varric had sent, but they occupied the same position in the message, the final line, appended without context or explanation, and the Varric's translation matrix would render them into Varric language as a concept that was newly possible to render because of the 17 subclasses and 3 provisional categories that the regional collective had added to its classification system 6 days ago. The 3 words were, "Come and see." The message was sent at 3:40 hours asteroid local time. Shen killed the drive modifications afterward and spent 40 minutes running diagnostics on every component she had pushed past spec, with the focused grimness of an engineer cataloging the consequences of her own decisions. Nothing had broken irreparably. Several things had bent in directions that would require attention. She accepted this the way she accepted most things, thoroughly, without complaint, and with a detailed mental list of what would need doing. Dara was still at the console when Shen finished. She hadn't moved. She was looking at the transmission log, with the expression she wore when she was not thinking about what was in front of her, but using it as a surface to think against. "You think they'll answer," Shen said. "I think they'll have to." "That's not the same thing." "I know." Dara finally looked up. "But I think the question they sent, the 5-part communique, the 3 words at the end, I think that came from somewhere in them that isn't the part that makes decisions. The decision-making architecture is 3 million years old and very stable. But something else sent that question, something that their classification systems don't have a category for." Shen was quiet for a moment. She had a way of being quiet that was not passive. It had the quality of active computation, of a mind running through a problem systematically and efficiently. She had been navigating through impossible things for 35 years, and she had long since developed the habit of treating all problems, including unprecedented ones, with the same methodical attention. My grandmother, she said, used to say that you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by what they asked for when they were lost. Dara waited. Most people ask for directions, Shen said. Some people ask for company. Occasionally, someone asks for an explanation of how they got lost in the first place. She looked at the transmission log. Those last ones are the interesting ones. She went to bed. Dara stayed at the console for another hour, then went to check on Mira. The girl was asleep. Archive was not. He was sitting on the shelf above her bunk in the posture of a cat who has taken on security responsibilities and finds them demanding. When Dara came to the doorway, he looked at her with the specific evaluative gaze that cats direct at people who appear at unexpected hours, and apparently she passed whatever assessment he was running because he looked away again. Mira's breathing was the slow, even breathing of deep sleep. In sleep, she looked unambiguously like a child. The years of accelerated development that made her serious and precise and occasionally unsettling were not visible when she was asleep. She looked like what she also was, a small person who had been running for a very long time and had finally, in this particular space, found something that felt safe enough to rest in. Dara stood in the doorway for a while. She thought about the 43 systems. She thought about the people in them, the 43 civilizations, the billions or trillions of individuals, each one of them living specific and particular lives, full of specific and particular connections that had not prevented the harvest. She thought about what it would take, in the time that the primary collective's review might buy them, to build something that would mean a 45th system never happened. Not a weapon, not a shield, something else. Something they would have to invent because it had never existed before, because no prior civilization had survived long enough to need it. An architecture, a way of preserving and transmitting and growing the thing that the Varric had no category for. She went to bed. She slept and did not dream, and woke with the particular clarity that comes from sleeping in a situation serious enough to shut down the dream-generating machinery entirely. The primary collective's response took 11 days. During those 11 days, the scout ship's crew went on living in the way that people live, when they are waiting for something enormous and have nothing to do about the enormity except continue being themselves. Russell found a way to requisition 2 crates of actual coffee, not substitute, from a trading contact 3. Systems over, through a chain of arrangements that he declined to fully explain but which Shen described as audaciously illegal and completely effective. And the smell of real coffee in the asteroid base was so extravagantly ordinary that everyone stopped moving for approximately 40 seconds the first morning it was brewed, just stood in the common area breathing it. Russell had not, in the days of transit and the subsequent days in the asteroid base, said very much about himself. He was not a reticent man by nature. Dara had observed that he was in fact a naturally communicative person who had learned, through long professional practice, to direct that communication outward rather than inward. He asked good questions. He listened carefully. He had, in 48 hours, accumulated a working operational knowledge of the asteroid-based systems, personnel dynamics, and resource situation that was considerably more detailed than the briefing documents Dara had prepared would have provided, because he had obtained it through conversation rather than reading. But he had said very little about his own history. On the 4th day, Mira asked him, they were in the common room after the second evening meal, the first one where everyone had been present simultaneously, which had a particular quality that Dara associated with the establishment of genuine, rather than provisional community. And Mira was doing the thing she did at the end of days, sitting with each person in the patient and attentive way that had stopped feeling intrusive approximately a week ago, and now felt simply like what it was, a kind of attention that was honest about being attention. You were a policeman, Mira said. 19 years, Russell said. You investigated things. People mostly. Things were usually simpler. He turned the flask over. Things didn't have reasons. People always had reasons. What kinds of reasons, he considered. Fear, mostly. That was the one underneath all the others. Whatever they said the reason was, money, anger, revenge, accident, ideology, when you dug far enough down there was usually fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of being exposed, fear of being less than they'd been told they were supposed to be. He paused. The interesting cases were the ones where there wasn't fear, where you dug all the way down and found something else. What else? He thought about it for longer than the question seemed to require, which was its own answer. Grief, sometimes, he said. Not as a justification, just as an explanation. This person did this thing because they were broken in this particular way and hadn't found a way through it yet. He looked at the flask. Those were the hard ones. Not because they were complicated, because they weren't. Mira was quiet for a moment. What happened to the ones that didn't have fear? Mostly I got them through the system as carefully as I could and wrote my reports and tried to make sure the record said what actually happened rather than what was easiest to say. He looked at her. Not always. I wasn't always that good. But mostly. That's why you remember their names, Myra said. He was still for a moment. The 41 cases, she said. You remember all of them? Yes. That's not a police thing. That's a you thing. I suppose it is. She reached over and touched the flask briefly, the way she touched things she wanted to understand. Light and deliberate and without any self-consciousness about what she was doing. Then she withdrew her hand. He loved you, she said. The person who gave you that. Russell's expression moved through several things quickly and settled into something that was not grief exactly, but was in the territory adjacent to it. Yes, he said, and you loved him. Yes. The loving didn't stop, Mira said. I can feel it from here. She considered her vocabulary. It's very loud. Russell made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. He set the flask down upright on the table and looked at it. Loud, he repeated. The warmest ones are always the loudest, she said. I don't know why, but they are. He sat with this. After a while, he said, Can you tell, is there anything from him? In the signal? Mira looked at the flask. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the quality of the silence changed twice. Yes, she said. He closed his eyes. She didn't say anything else. She reached over and put her small hand over his larger one for exactly as long as it needed to be there, and then she moved on because she understood, in the way she understood things that she had no language for, but experienced with full clarity, that the most respectful thing you can do with a revelation is let it settle in its own time. Mira was growing. Not rapidly, not visibly day to day, but she was growing. Her feet reached the floor of most chairs now. She had developed an opinion about navigation mathematics that Shen found, to her visible irritation, to be correct. She had also developed a habit of sitting with each member of the crew for an hour a day in specific and deliberate contact, not talking, just present. And the quality of those hours was such that each of the 4 adults had independently begun rearranging their schedules to protect them. Kale hummed less without knowing he was doing it, and smiled more without knowing that either. Archive caught something in the asteroid base that should not have been there, and presented it to Mira with enormous pride. And the something turned out to be a juvenile tunnel rat that had apparently stowed away in one of the supply crates from the trading contact, which Mira named 17 and kept in a box, and which Archive subsequently guarded with proprietary and somewhat contradictory intensity. These were the things that happened during the 11 days. The primary collective's response arrived on the morning of the 12th day. It was long. The translation took the ship's processing systems in 4 hours. When it came through in full, it was the kind of document that takes a long time to read, not because the words are difficult, but because the weight of what's between them requires repeated pausing. Dara read it once, then she read it again. Then she set it down and sat very still for a while. Russell came in and saw her face and sat across from her and didn't ask. She said after a while they want to negotiate. He waited, not to surrender, not a cessation agreement. They're not equipped for those concepts in the way we'd understand them. She organized her thoughts. They want to propose a classification category for us, for what we are, for what we have. She looked up. In the primary collective's 3 million-year archive, there are 44 resource categories used to classify inhabited planets. Minerals, atmospherics, biologicals, everything they've ever encountered and assessed as valuable. She paused. They want to add a 45th. What would they call it? Russell said. She looked down at the document again, at the translation that the processing system had settled on after 4 hours of working through a concept that had required 17 subclasses and 3 provisional categories just to approximate. They translated it as irreplaceable, she said, but the notes say the original term is closer to something that would translate as the thing, without which the map is incomplete. The flask turned over and over in Russell's hands. He looked at the printout above his workstation. What have we missed? 43 systems, he said. Yes, and we're the 44th. And possibly, Dara said carefully, the last one they'll approach the old way. The silence in the common room had a different quality from all the prior silences. Not the weight of accumulated violence, not the tension of imminent danger, not the careful quietude of people trying to survive an impossible situation. It was the silence of a moment that has not yet become a thing that can be described. Before language catches up with it, before it gets a name, before it passes from the territory of the felt into the territory of the known. Mira came in from the navigation room, carrying Archive, who had apparently decided that voluntary transportation was preferable to walking. She stopped when she saw their faces. Did they answer? She said. Yes, Dara said. What did they say? Dara thought about how to say it. They said they've been measuring things for 3 million years, she said, and they just found out there's something they forgot to measure. Mira considered this. She set Archive down, and he immediately went to investigate the new smell of real coffee with the methodical thoroughness that he brought to all new smells. Are they going to stop? Mira asked. They're going to try something different, Dara said. Whether that's the same as stopping depends on what they try. But they asked. Yes, and you answered. Yes. Mira sat down at the table, in her usual chair, and thought about this with the serious and unhurried quality she brought to important thoughts. Outside the asteroid's hull, in the cold distance, the stars held their positions with the patient constancy that stars maintain, regardless of what is decided or undecided in the small warm spaces between them. Good, Mira said. She pulled the tablet toward her, opened the navigation mathematics, found the place where she disagreed with Shen's calculation yesterday, and where Shen had, with considerable professional reluctance, confirmed she was right. She started working. Across the room, Kale stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work. The 5-bar melody played once, very quietly in the back of his mind, warm as old light. He hummed it without knowing he was doing it. Mira looked up from the tablet and smiled. She had always known the tune. Shen found Kale on the observation deck on the 9th day, which was the smallest space in the asteroid base, and had the best viewport, and was the place that people went when they needed to look at something larger than their immediate circumstances. She sat across from him and didn't say anything for a while. Shen had the rare quality of comfortable silence. She could share a room with a problem for a long time before she addressed it, which made her an unusual conversation partner and an exceptional navigator. She told you, he said, that you were their experiment. Yes, and that I failed. She said the design failed. She said you were very successful. Shen looked at the stars. There's a difference. He was quiet. How long were you with them? She asked. Fraud recruited me when I was 16. I didn't know what they were. I thought. He stopped, reconsidered. I thought it was a research institution. The kind that pays very well and asks you to sign documents that you don't fully read when you're 16. And the alternative is the kind of future that the occupation had produced for people without resources. He looked at his hands. I was there for 6 years before I understood enough to understand what I was part of. And by that time, the modifications were already made, and I had no way out that didn't end with me dead or recaptured. What changed? The woman they cloned to make Mira. He said it simply, the way you say things that have moved past being painful into being simply true. Her name was Sarah. I met her in my 3rd year. She was already a prisoner. They'd been studying her since before I arrived. But he stopped again differently this time. She was the first person I'd met in 3 years who talked to me like I was a person rather than an asset. She didn't know what they'd done to me. She just saw a 16-year-old who'd made a bad decision and wound up in a bad situation and treated me accordingly. The viewport held the stars in their fixed positions, patient and indifferent to the small warm things discussing them. She died before I got out, he said. They were done with her. They'd taken everything they needed. The modifications they'd made to me were based on her architecture, and they'd moved on to the replication phase. His voice was even. I found out about the replication project after I got out. I found out which facility they were running it in. I found out there were 3 survivors. He paused. I went and got the one that was left. Mira, Shensa said, yes. And the 6 years of Fraud's modifications, the thing you have instead of what they intended. It's hers, he said. The architecture, the version they implanted in me was based on her structure. It didn't manifest the way they expected because, he looked at his hands again, because it was never a tool. It was the thing she was. When you take the thing a person is and try to make it into a tool, it doesn't usually cooperate. Shen nodded once, slowly, in the way she acknowledged things that confirmed existing conclusions. What does it feel like, she asked, when you use it? He thought about how to answer honestly. It feels like the truth, he said. Not a truth I know and they don't. The truth we both already know. The one that's been running underneath everything else the whole time. He looked at the viewport. The Fraud operatives in the hub. They didn't change their minds because I told them something new. They changed because I reminded them of something they'd always known and had been successfully ignoring. That they were on the wrong side. That there's only one side, he said. Eventually, when everything else falls away. Shen was quiet for a long time. She had the flask-turning quality without the flask. Something in her hands that was always moving, processing. Finally, she said, my grandmother's village was the third one they processed, with the chorus drones. Before we understood what the drones were doing, before anyone had documented the effect. She said it without emotion, not because she felt none, but because she had arranged the emotion into a form. She could carry 41 people, the whole village. They were fine physically. Physically perfect, in fact. The Varrock's process is very clean. She looked at the stars. They just weren't connected anymore. To each other, to themselves, to anything. The village still functioned. People still moved and worked and ate, but the thing that made it a village was gone. She paused. I was visiting my cousin 3 days' travel away when it happened. I came back and I sat with my grandmother for 6 hours, and she looked at me like I was a horizon she was trying to remember. The observation deck was very still. That's what they do, she said. That's the harvest. They don't take anything from the body. They take the thing that makes the body matter. And Mira is the thing that makes it matter. Amplified, broadcast, accumulated. Shen's voice was steady and precise as it always was. When the chorus drone tried to run its process on her, it found the field already full, because she'd been filling it for 9 months with. She searched for the word. Everything, Kale said. Yes, Shen said. Everything. She stood up and brushed off her jacket in the economical way she did everything. My grandmother's name was Lifen, she said, in case you were keeping a list. She went back to work. Kale stayed on the observation deck for another hour looking at the stars, thinking about lists and names and the specific weight of things you carry, because the weight is exactly what they're for. When he came back to the common area, Mira was awake, sitting at the table in the low light with Archive and 17 the Tunnel Rat, who had arrived at a provisional détente that consisted of Archive pretending not to see, 17 and 17 pretending not to be visible, and both of them secretly sharing a food source that they each believed the other didn't know about. Mira looked up when Kale came in. She had that expression, the one that meant she already knew. Liffen, he said. She nodded. Add her to the list, he said. I already have, said Mira. He sat down across from her. Archive relocated from Mira's lap to his, uninvited but with absolute conviction, and settled there with the expression of an animal who has made an irreversible decision about where it belongs. Kale put his hand on the cat's back. The cat pressed upward into the contact. Can I tell you something? Mira said. Yes. The signal that the Varrock are calling a cascade amplifier effect. The thing they've been trying to harvest and study and measure. She looked at her tablet, then at him. I've been thinking about what it actually is, what it's for. What have you concluded? I think it's memory, she said. Not the kind in your head. The kind in the space between people. The kind that says, this happened, this mattered, these people were here, this love was real. She was thinking out loud, which was a different mode than her usual precision, less structured, more exploratory, the way thought looks when it's happening rather than when it's arrived. The Varrock's process takes that memory away, not the facts, the feeling of the facts, the weight of them, the way they're connected to each other and to everything else. She looked at Archive, and I can feel where it's been taken. I can feel the gaps. She looked up at him, like the 43 systems. I can feel them, not as data, as absence. Like trying to hear a chord and 3 of the notes aren't there. He looked at her steadily. I think, she said carefully, that if we can answer the primary collective's question, really answer it, not just describe the signal, but show them what the absence of it costs, we might be able to reach the part of them that still, somewhere, in 3 million years of accumulated evolution, remembers what it was like before they lost it. You think they lost it, he said. Not evolved past it. I think losing and evolving are sometimes the same thing, she said, depending on what you're measuring. He thought about this for a long time. The drone, he said. She nodded. When you filled the carrier, when the drone tried to overwrite it and found it already full, what did you fill it with? She considered this with the honesty she brought to questions about her own nature. All of it, she said. Shen's grandmother, your mother's melody, Russell's 41 names, Dara's theory, Archive's tale, everything I've been carrying since I started paying attention. She paused, and the 43 systems, the gap cord. I put that in too. He was very still. I showed them what they'd taken, she said quietly. Not as an accusation, just, here, this is what absence feels like from the inside. This is what a chord sounds like with 3 notes missing. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he did, his voice was the same as always, flat, controlled, produced in a register that had learned not to carry more than it needed to carry. Do you think they felt it, he said. I think that's what broke the drone's classification system, she said, and I think it's what made someone in the regional collective send that question. She looked at the viewport and the stars. I think somewhere in there, in all that enormous machinery of 3 million years, something felt the cord with its gaps in it, and for the first time had no category for thiefling. The night cycle of the asteroid base had lowered the ambient light to its minimum, and the viewport above them held the stars in their clean, indifferent perfection, and the common room was warm, and Archive breathed against Kale's hand in the slow, even rhythm of a creature that has determined it is exactly where it should be. The primary collective will answer, Mira said. Not a question, not a hope. The same tone she'd used in the tunnel when she'd said, left, then down. Yes, Kale said. And after that, he said, we figure out what comes next. You're not scared, no. She tilted her head. You were scared in the hub, when the drone came down. That was different. How? He thought about it. Then I was scared of losing something, he said. Now I'm scared of something much larger, which is, he paused, whether we're adequate to the size of what's in front of us, whether any of us is. She considered this. I think that's the right thing to be scared of. Yes. And I think, she said, that the answer is the same as it's always been. He waited. Not one of us, she said. All of us. She looked at Archive at 17 in his box, at the flask on the shelf, at the printout above Russell's workstation. That's the whole answer. That's always been the whole answer. He hummed, without knowing he was doing it, the first bar of the melody. She smiled without saying anything, because she had known it for 6 months and it had never needed saying. The stars kept moving outside the viewport, traveling their enormous indifferent distances, and in the small warm space of the asteroid base, 5 people, and 1 cat, and 1 tunnel rat, and the accumulated signal of everything they'd ever carried, or been given, or refused to put down, waited for the most powerful civilization in the map galaxy to finish asking the most important question it had ever asked. And Mira went back to work on the navigation mathematics, and Kale sat with Archive in his lap and watched the stars, and the 5-bar melody moved through the warm air of the common room like something that had always been there and had simply at last found its way home.